I'm good.
Just give him a signal, and so if you'd like to start reading and settle. I'm going to grab food after I get started. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm not going to stand in front of the microphone. Usually I have a lot of are trying something a little bit different. So the diversity and inclusion committee is trying to think of some different activities that we can do, different things that we can participate in, just to increase our awareness, increase our conversations around diversity and inclusion, so that it's just woven into the fabric. Not that it isn't already, but there's always more an opportunity, I think, where we can even enhance what we're doing right now. We are fortunate that nobody has to be an expert in everything, right? So we are fortunate to have Andre Koen with us today. He's going to help facilitate this. He is an Office of Diversity and Inclusion Program Director. And I'm going to please.
No, please do. No, it's fine.
He is an energetic presenter. Dr. Sia has had an opportunity to be at an event facilitated by Andre, and he comes highly recommended. So I think this hopefully will be a very good and engaging session today. He's a powerful communicator, a dynamic speaker, there are many kind words that describe them. The most illustrative is Andre the enkindled spirit. All right. Last 15 years, Andre has been a diversity trainer in Minnesota. His time as a K-12 classroom. Bless your heart.
Thank you.
Affirmative action officer in he has given a solid platform for looking at diversity and inclusion in many different ways, and that's really what we're hoping to pick up here as well. Most of his clients included professionals moving to community education sectors, and again, as I mentioned, now we are fortunate to have him here at Mayo in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion Program Director. So you have a variety of different staff members here, part of our team in infectious diseases. And with that, we'll let Andre pick up and enjoy the sunshine, and we'll go over this building.
Yeah. Well, thank you for inviting me to this conversation. I was a little bit nervous because you have food in front of you, and so if I didn't do a good job, you might use it as projectile. So I got a little bit nervous, but we're all family here, so to speak. So I do come from I come out of a context, and my context is important in recognizing who I am and how I have come to be before you. Right? So my dad was in 1968, something happened to my father, or actually happened in the world that shaped my father's worldview. And what do you think that one thing that could have happened in 1968 that could have shaped my father's worldview that was pretty traumatic, not only for him, but the nation as a whole? I know for many of you it's ancient history. The assassination of Dr. King. And so my father decided he wanted to do something about that. So Dr. King was killed in April. My dad graduated from high school in June, and he told my grandfather, I want to do something about this. And my grandfather said, great, but do it someplace else, because my grandfather wasn't the kind of guy that was into revolutions, right? So his modality for going through life was keep your nose clean and keep your head down, right? And so my father joined a group called the Black Panthers. I don't know what you know about Black Panthers, what you think you know about Black Panthers, but primarily they were an organization designed to get people out of poverty, and specifically Black people out of poverty. And so they became somewhat notorious or famous, depending on which side of history you look at them. And so J. Edgar Hoover took a special interest in this particular group, which is why we don't necessarily see them as active as they were back in the day. But there is one remnant of the Panther movement that is still around today. How many people ate breakfast before you went to school? Anybody participate in a school lunch program that happened in the morning, so breakfast at school? Okay, I certainly did. I was in a public school, and we had breakfast before we went to school, and that's a remnant of one of the Panthers' methodology. So that was something that they were trying to do, make sure kids had something to eat before they engaged in academic pursuits. And so, as a revolutionary, my father found that the retirement plan for revolutionaries was a horrible plan. Right, so revolutionaries don't typically end up well, and there is no health care or 401k for revolutionaries. So he was looking for other things to do, and in his pursuit, he got a call from God. Now, I don't know what would happen if you got a call from God. I certainly would answer. I was in one session and someone said, "You run," and I said, "Where, Jonah?" Right, so his name was Jonah. And anyway, so my father became a fire and brimstone preacher, and so as we're engaging today, if it feels like I'm preaching, it's not my fault. It's my father in me. And if it feels like I have some kind of political or social agenda, I do. And it's called the Constitution of the United States. And so although we are talking about health-related relationships, it is important to recognize the greater context by which we operate. This this country, with all of its failings and all of its shortcomings, I believe is one of the best nations on the face of the earth. And there's no other place other than Malmo, Sweden, that I would rather be than, okay, that was a joke about the weather's the same in Malmo as it is here in Minnesota. Okay. All right, I won't tell that joke again. It's out. So to that end, I want this to be a participatory conversation. I have 77 PowerPoint slides that at your convenience, you can go through every last one of them, but I will not do that today. But right in front of you is a packet of paper, and I'd like for everyone to take one of those pieces of paper, and on the front of that, there are 5 dark gray circles. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What I want you to do is to put one thing that you value or that is important to you in each one of those dark circles, right? So there'll be 5 things that you write down right on the cover of that. So 5 things that you value or that are important to you. So it could be a person, like a niece or a grandchild or a significant other. It could be a thing like a boat or a motorcycle. It could be a place like Belize or Bemidji. It could be a concept like freedom or justice. All right? So write one of those things down in each one of those circles. And just word association, and no deep thought. You can just, whatever pops in the top of your head, just write that down. All right, it looks like most people have 4, if not all 5. So we'll go to part 2. So what I'd like for you to do is play a game, and the game is very simple. What I want you to do is to find 2 people for each one of the things that you wrote down, and I want you to find people who either agree with what you have, like, oh yeah, that's a really good idea, or they have something similar on their paper. Once you find those individuals, I want them to put their signature next to the circle that they either have that is similar to yours, or that you say, that's a really good idea, all right? So at a minimum, how many signatures should we have at a minimum? If we decide 2 for each one. 10, right? So you have 10, you have 5 things. If you get a minimum of 2 signatures for each one, you should have a minimum of 10 signatures, all right? You have 90 seconds to do this, starting now. $60 seconds.
I have my family, my son, my mom, my home, freedom, and spirituality. We got family, home. There you go. Yeah. That's my signature. That's good, right? Alright. Probably by my son. My mom. Yeah. That'll work.
Your son. Family for sure. Democracy's coming.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and game over. Game over. So, as you were going around the room, you were talking with your colleagues, were there things that you saw in other people's papers and you were like, oh man, I should have wrote that down? Yeah. Okay, what were some of the things that you saw that you felt you should have wrote down? Yes, freedom. All right, so you saw that on someone else's paper and said, yeah, I value freedom myself. All right, other folks, what did you see? What was that? We take that freedom for granted. Yeah, we oftentimes do, right? What else did people see that they said, you know what, I should have wrote that down? What's that? Faith, your faith, right? One of those things that motivates many of us to interact with the world is our faith, right? Cool. As you were also going around the room, were there things that were more difficult to find somebody to sign on? Or maybe you didn't find someone, maybe it's empty or whatnot. What were some of those things? Money, right? All right, so please raise your hand if you value money, even if you don't have enough or or need your money to pay your bills. Please raise your hand if you value money. If money is important, it's important to live. Fair, right? All right, what's another that you either didn't find someone to sign on or yes? Diversity. All right, cool. Please raise your hand if you value diversity, even if it wasn't written on your paper. You value diversity in all its forms, right? Okay, cool. One more. Education. Please raise your hand if you value education. And what was that last one? Humor. Please raise your hand if you value humor. Yes, right? Particularly given the right context, right? So, I don't try to do surgery because I'm not a surgeon, and some people shouldn't do comedy because they're not comedians. It's just that kind of thing. But I do want to say, what do you think what's the impetus? So, like, why would I start the session with an activity like this? You're pretty smart. Yes. So that we can see the similarities and the differences. And so one of the things that I want you to walk away with out of this room is a more refined definition of diversity, right? And it is the recognition and the honoring of our commonalities and our differences simultaneously. So it's the recognition of our commonalities and our differences simultaneously. Oftentimes, I don't know about you, how many people have been to a cultural competence training before, or a diversity training, or sensitivity training, even sexual harassment training, right? Okay, so many of us have been to, and so you are the people I have to fix. The rest of you are doing great. So oftentimes what we fail to realize is the context by which people are operating, right? So if I see behaviors but I don't understand the context, is it possible that I could be missing something, right? So anyone grow up on a farm? All right, cool. Are there certain things that on a farm folks have to know to run an effective farm? Are there particular things they have to know? All right, so what are some of those things? Yeah, so how to use multiple, because you can't take that John Deere tractor up to, Jiffy Lube and say, hook me up, right? I mean, it doesn't, so they have to know how to operate machinery, right, in a different kinds of way. How to use food and seeds and repurpose stuff, right? What else do they have to know? Yeah, so you know, animal husbandry, how to when the schedule for feeding and markets and all that kind of stuff, and safety. Stay away from the PTO shaft. Okay, I don't know what that is. I'll be Googling this afternoon. Right? They have to be a meteorologist, a veterinarian, have an MBA in business, right? So on a farm, there's a certain amount of intelligence that farmer has to have. But if that farmer leaves the farm and goes to New York, what might the New Yorker say about that farmer? That he has no clue. That in fact, he may not even be intelligent. When the fact that the matter is, they are intelligent, but context is everything. And so if we took that New Yorker, put that New Yorker on the farm, what would the farmer say about this New Yorker? He's a city slicker, right? Or he may say what my grandfather would say about a dog that doesn't hunt. You know, what do you do with a dog that doesn't hunt? And my grandfather would say, shoot it. I'm not saying that I don't know if he did that, but all of his dogs seem to run away at a certain point. I don't know what happened, right? So context is extremely important. So if we don't understand the context of behaviors, and particularly as we talk about infectious diseases, what we recognize is that the diseases are out there, but they are propagated through human behavior. Right, so it is oftentimes human behaviors that propagate some of the particular communicable diseases that we have. Right, so we can understand why people do what they do, then we can help them, particularly help us in this particular field. And I won't go too far down that path because you know way more than I do on that. But I will suggest that we can augment or help humans understand their behavior. So let's go to that larger circle. And that larger circle is the circle of all human knowledge. Okay, I'm a little melodramatic, but it got your attention, didn't it? All right. So, but let's call that the pie of all information. The pie of all information. What I want you to do is to cut yourself a piece of pie the size of what you know of everything there is to know. So cut yourself a piece of pie the size of what you know of everything that there is to know. All right, so it's all history, all math, all languages, all cultures, all religious traditions, all of those things. All right? Cool. What kinds of things are contained in that circle, in that pie for you, that piece of pie for you? What's contained in, what are things you know? Let's just start with three. What are three things that folks know that is contained in that piece of pie? What do you know?
No, for sure.
No, for sure. What are you pretty certain about?
I know that I know very little.
Okay, so you know that you know very little. All right.
Staff oriented is job security.
So staff what?
Staff infections are job security for us.
Oh, okay. So, all right. Oh, that's staff infection. I thought you meant infected staff. All right. All right. What's one more thing you know? You know, Thomas. You know how to cut the grass. All right, great. So those are things that are inside of the piece of pie of what you know. Next, I want you to cut yourself a second piece of pie, which is the size of what you know you don't know, right? So I know that I don't know Mandarin Chinese. I also know that I should not, I don't know how to fly an airplane, and I now know that I should stop doing lobotomies. Okay, that was a joke too. She was like, for real? Like, you do it for real? Okay, no, not for real. All right, so there are things that you know that you don't know. What I want you to do is to cut a second piece of pie that is quantifiable. Now, some of you may say, well, that's the rest of the pie. I want to challenge you on that because there's a third piece of pie that we'll talk about. All right? So cut yourself a piece of pie the size of what you know you don't know. Yep, you know that you don't know. So you are aware of the fact that you don't know this, that, or the other. All right? So what are some examples of things that people are familiar with, and they know that they don't know?
Neurosurgery.
What kind of surgery?
Neurosurgery.
Neural surgery, right? So please raise your hand if you also know you don't know how to do neural surgery. All right, good, because if your hand was down, I'm calling on you. All right, what's another that you know that you don't know? Calculus. Please raise your hand if you also know that you don't know calculus. All right, cool. One last thing. What do you think? Languages. All right, so if you don't speak more than 5 languages, put your hands up. If you don't speak, okay, cool. All right, so there are things that we know, the things that we know we don't know, and what do we think that last part of the pie is? What we don't know that we don't know, or our blind spot. So write the word blind spot in that last piece of pie. So I have what I know, I have what I know I don't know, and then I have what I don't know, or my blind spot. If I add all 3 of those pieces, I might call that circle my paradigm. So if you can write that word next to the circle somewhere, paradigm. P-A-R-A-D-I-G-M. I used to say paradigm. I was hooked on phonics. It worked for me. So paradigm. And a paradigm, have people heard of a paradigm shift? Right? So what are people talking about when they say paradigm shift? Or what is a paradigm? What's a paradigm? How you see, is that what you're going to say that too? How you see the world, right? So a paradigm is simply how you see the world. And the context that you come from shapes how you see the world and how you don't see the world, right? So a paradigm. So people are talking about this paradigm shift. They want us to see the world differently because there could be some things we're missing, right? So let's do this. On your table, there should have been a set of cards. I want to take about mostly 5. Okay, so I want to take about 6 minutes, and that deck of cards are some questions. And what I'd like for you to do is to answer those questions however you see fit, right? So if that means one person reads a card and everybody answers that, or each person takes a card. But I'll give you about 6 minutes to go through that deck of cards, and then we'll come back and have a larger piece of conversation. All right? Cool. No, the red, white, and blue cards. The red, white, and blue cards. Yeah, it's a conversation based on these cards. Oh, yeah. No, just have a conversation based on those cards.
Why not?
Five, four, three, two, one, and so.
So, Ed, how was that exercise? Going through that exercise, how was that? It was interesting. Okay. So my mother says that about ugly babies. So when you say interesting, what do you mean? What did you find interesting?
Other people's perspectives.
Okay. So other people's perspectives on the questions. All right. Other folks. What did you think of? Some questions were hard to answer. Would you mind sharing one of those that may have been difficult to answer for your group? What should people know about you? Yeah. So for me, what people should know about me is that I get hangry. So right around lunchtime, if food is not on the way, I am hungry and I'm angry, right? And what's that? No, I'm good. I'm good.
He's starting to be.
I'm starting to be hangry, but I'm always hangry. Remember that from Avengers? Okay. All right. So the important thing is, how many of those questions have you never really thought about? Were there any questions that you really hadn't given much thought to? Okay. Some questions. All right. Cool. So one way to get rid of those blind spots is to look for the things you don't know that they're there. And so those questions were designed to help us kind of think critically about things that oftentimes we don't think about. Particularly in ways we're either in the dominant culture where we don't have to think about things, or things just come naturally to us, or in ways in which we find ourselves in the kind of in a subculture or side culture to the dominant culture, right? What do baby elephants have to know about big elephants? Everything. They have to know everything about big elephants. And oftentimes, particularly when we talk about diversity and inclusion, people who have, that are either titled by titles, minority groups or underrepresented groups or whatnot, oftentimes know a lot more about the dominant culture than the dominant culture actually knows about them, right? So as an example, can you name brand 3 hair care products that someone like me might need to use? Oftentimes when I ask that question, people don't have an answer to that. However, I can say, I know what that is about other people, right? About other groups. And so when we think about this diversity and inclusion piece, it is our commonalities and our differences, but it's also recognizing that we have some information about those things, right? So that's cool. So let's go down to the bottom of the first page. I can't believe we're still on the first page. How many triangles do you see in that diagram? Count the triangles. So I have 8. Anyone have more than 8 or less than 8? You have 11. Oh, I have 8, I have 11. No, it's not my stomach. That's a good question though, right? All right. So we have 8, we have 11, and then people are unsure. So let's back up and ask a question. How many sides does a triangle have? 3. In this diagram, are there any shapes in here that have 3 sides? So there are no triangles in this shape, right? There are no triangles in this shape. So what happened? How are people able to see up to 11 or 8 triangles? We made assumptions, like what? That there were lines there that in fact were what? Not there, right? And so sometimes we do that even with our clients. And it is so funny, or the patients that we work with, or the people that we're interacting with, right? So, body mass index does not necessarily equate to health. Having a particular body mass, it is a clue to maybe there's some, but it's not a direct correlation. And so we have to be critical about the inputs that we're taking in and how we try to make meaning of those things, right? So here's a diagram of diversity and inclusion. It's our commonalities and our differences. I want to hit, and these are all slides you can pay attention to. And I think this is, for me, one of the most important parts that I want to touch on, which is the truths about human beings and their motivations, right? So human beings can learn, change, and grow. Do we all agree about that? Yeah, right? So behaviors are things that can be modified, and humans can learn, change, and grow. If that wasn't true, many of us wouldn't be in this room today because we'd still be doing the goofy things that I used to do when I was 17, right? So I'm glad I don't do those things anymore. People do what they think works, even when what? Even when it doesn't work, right? So they use unsafe practices because at some point they believe that those unsafe practices were actually beneficial to them, right? So people do what they think works, even when it doesn't. And why? Because I just gave you the answer to that question. Why do they do those things that are ineffective or ineffective? Because they have worked before, right? And so you have a client who is, or a community member who uses anger to get what they want. Why do they do that? Because people have acquiesced before, because it's been effective before. So some people, I was looking at Epic the other day, and they were, one of the questions was, what method of contraceptive do you use? And one of the methods was pull-out method. I about fell on the floor, but it's a good question to ask because people think that people do use that method. And why do they do that? Because it's been effective. They thought that it was effective before. They don't know that they were just lucky. Or maybe unlucky because, anyway. And then that all human behavior is goal-directed. Human behavior is directed in a particular kind of way. And people are after something through their behaviors, right? And I want to give you a tool that will short-circuit any confusion you might have about the motivations of people who are in front of you. And then lastly, attitude is a reaction to a goal. Attitude is a side effect of something else, right? So how many of you have teenagers in your life? How many of you remember being teenagers in your life, right? So it's very interesting because conversations happen like this, and more now maybe so than in the past, but I think the dynamics are very much similar, right? So a young person comes up to an adult and says, "Mom, Marsha's having a party. It starts in 5 minutes. Can you drop me off?" What does the reasonable adult say? "No, what are you talking about? Who has a party that starts in 5 minutes? Or you knew this party was going to happen, and why are you asking me to?" So all this kind of stuff happens, right? And so what happens to the kid's attitude? Anger, frustration. They transform into this beast-like creature, right? And they go to the door and they slam it like they own the joint, right? But then the adult says, "You know what, Marsha does need her help. You know, she's got acne and some self-esteem problems, and it's good for my daughter, you know, my kid to be around this kid." So you go to the door, "What do you want?" "Okay, I was thinking you can go to the thing. I can't stay the whole time. I'll drop you off, I'll pick you up, I have some errands to run, get your stuff, let's go." What happens to the kid's attitude? Better. Why? Because he got what he wanted. So what is an attitude? It is a response to goal achievement. So if you have a person with a bad attitude that you're interacting with, what's the one thing you know about them before they even open their mouth or they tell you about their complaint? What do you already know? That there's something that they're not getting. Because if you give it to them, what kind of attitude do they have? A positive attitude. And they're probably using that attitude because it's been effective in the past, right? So attitude is a side effect. So when we see an attitude, we have to ask, what is the motive of this attitude? And I will tell you how to short circuit that in just a second. So there are three things that human beings are after. We're after significance, we're after belonging, we're after safety, right? So why do kids join gangs? Because the gang gives them either significance, belonging, or safety in some kind of relationship, right? Why would someone couch surf with the risk of exposing themselves or someone else to a sexually transmitted disease? Because at some point you have to pay in some other way, right? Why would they do that? Because that behavior gives them safety, significance, and belonging from their belief, right? And so when we think about these human behaviors that people do, they think works, attitude, the directedness towards these goals, how many of the people that we interact with who have these goals of safety, significance, and belonging ask our permission for the methods? They don't ask our permission for the methods, right? And so we have to recognize that even though they're not doing what we would think is a good thing for them, for some reason, they think it's a good thing for them, and it's pointed towards one of these three things. But if I can get a kid who's in a gang to recognize there's another way to get safety, significance, and belonging that doesn't, you don't have to risk your life, you don't have to do illegal activities or things that are anti-social or whatnot. If I can get them to see that, then I can actually help them change their behaviors and the trajectory of not only them, but everyone who is associated and related to them, right? So when we talk about, infectious diseases, if we can recognize that this is what people are after through their behaviors, we can help them renegotiate their behaviors so that they can get this in different ways that don't cause harm to themselves or the community. Does that make sense? Is that helpful, sort of, kind of? All right, so there's that. So I think that stuff is important. So at the bottom of your, so we just did this activity just a little while ago, but at the bottom of page 2, you'll see a diagram that looks very much like this. And I'm curious as to what you learned about certain groups kind of growing up, right? Or what groups were talked about when you grew up. So what did parents and family teach you about the categories across the top? What did friends say about those categories? What did school and workplace teach you about those categories? What did media and movie teach you about those categories? And then from your personal experience, what have you learned about those categories? But I want you to do it in a particular kind of way. If it was something positive that was said or demonstrated by the categories on the left, I want you to put a plus. If there was something negative, I want you to put a minus. If it was never anything that you had talked about, I want you to put a 0, all right? You can have pluses and minuses in the same section, but the size matters, right? So a big plus is lots of positive, and a little bit of negative is, a small negative is a little bit of things that weren't positive, right? So pluses, minuses, and zeros. So for example, parents and family, what did they tell me about my race and my racial group? They told me positive things, right? So that would be true for me. For LGBTI, my parents and family never talked about it. It was a big 0, right? So friends and family around LGBTI would be pluses and minuses, right? So you can have pluses, minuses, and zeros in those groups. All right, stop right where you are. What I'd like you to do is only give about 5 minutes for conversation. So please talk about your pluses, minuses, and zeros. Please share what you want to share. You don't have to share what you don't want to share. So I'll give about 5 minutes for that conversation, starting now.
Well, I mean, that was.
Four, three, two, one, stop. So, I do want to say, I know I didn't give enough time for full conversations about that. Hopefully everybody was able to share just a little bit. I don't need to know what your pluses, minuses, and zeros are. That is a self-assessment for you to recognize either how you got things or how you didn't get things. So as you were looking at those pluses, minuses, and zeros, was there anything that stood out for you as either a theme or something you found very interesting for your own learning as you were going through your process?
For us, at least for me, when I was going through this exercise, it's what the media and the TV has portrayed certain groups, in particular Native Americans, LGBTI groups, portrayed over the last 30 or 40 years and what role they played in that. And not a lot of it is positive.
Yeah, yeah. Did anyone else find that that there were a lot of negatives in TV and movies and the media? Okay. The interesting thing about that is, and we don't have time to do it now, but if I were to ask generations and see where generations were, I would imagine that folks who come from earlier generations may have many more negatives than people who come who have been raised in more kind of modern era. And so a large part of it is about the context and also where you grew up, right? So yeah, and why TV and movies? Why would folks have so many negatives? What is the purpose of media? Yeah, so introduce, entertain the dominant views to the masses, and can you develop complex characters in 22 minutes? Can you tell complex stories because that's the average, sitcom, particularly, when I grew up in the 80s, was about 22 minutes. You add the commercials, that's your half-hour show, right? I think there's one show that's trying to do that, which is This Is Us, and I hate watching that show because I cry every episode, right? So we have to recognize that TV, movies, and media, and that's all forms of media, right now they have one purpose, which is to do what? Make money through advertising. Right? So I don't know if you've noticed, but you'll see, shows and they're like, this tragic thing happened, or this, and they're coming after this, or they want to do this to you, and then at the commercial break, are you suffering from anxiety? Is your blood pressure high? Take this, and your arm will fall off. The side effects are your arm may fall off, your eye might, whatever.
They go very fast when the arm is going to fall off.
Right. It goes really fast. All the disclaimers, right? So you watch the same thing I watch. But I want us to recognize that whatever context we come, whatever our people taught us or didn't teach us or whatever, is not our fault. However, now that we're at the age of accountability, it is our responsibility to understand those things and to uncover those things for ourselves, right? So what my parents could have never taught me about sexting, right? Using texting to have personal relationships with other people, right? Why could my parents never have taught me about that? Because it didn't exist then, right? But now I'm, my daughter's 4, and I'm making sure that I know what to look for, with Snapchat and all this other stuff, right? So yeah, you got to do it. So that's important. I do want to just hit a couple of things before we go. And unfortunately, I'm an overachiever and extremely nervous, so I packed our agenda with way too much stuff that we won't be able to cover everything. But that's also a built-in marketing thing that you have to invite me back to get more. Right? So, but if you wouldn't mind, go to page 6 and page 7, and I just want to talk a little bit about this idea of equity. So equity simply is making sure that diversity is honored in ways that people can have equal or just outcomes, right? So many of you have seen these diagrams, but it took me a long time to figure out those diagrams at the top of page 6, what the real mystery was. And the mystery was, how do we remove the barriers, right? And so too often we're thinking about, orchestrating things to make things equitable for people, when in fact, if we're able just to remove barriers that are no longer working for us, then we don't have to go through all of those things. And so we should think about what are some processes or procedures that are barriers to people. And that's where a concept that I've gotten from Mayo that I really love and adore, which is the dissenting voice, right? So typically we can have equity when someone is bringing up, also referred to as a minority report, right? Bringing up that dissenting voice to make sure that everyone is at the table, that a decision that we make impacts, if a decision that we're making may impact people that aren't at the table making the decision. So how do we do that with that dissenting voice? And that creates this idea of equity. The last two things are about this idea of intersectionality. So when I went to my primary care physician, who was here in Mayo, so don't look him up in Epic, we were talking about some things because I'm 49, and this public information. And so he said there are certain things we need to start looking for. And so he said certain tests that, you know, blah, 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 blah. And so and so he said, you know, in the next couple of years we'll be doing these things. And I said, sir, I do want to bring up the fact that I'm African American. If you haven't noticed, I just want to bring that up. And so is that also true for African Americans? And he laughed and he chuckled. And he said, well, let me go check. And so he went back and checked. And sure enough, he found out that for the general population, age 50 is when we're supposed to do that, but actually for African Americans, we're supposed to do that at age 49, right? And so, had we not looked at intersectionality, there may have been an opportunity for me to get served or diagnosed because we're looking at the general population as opposed to the uniqueness of my ethnicity, right? And so those commonalities and differences are important, but we also have to recognize that they have some ties. And so that's intersectionality, it's the concept of intersectionality. And lastly, we should really be thinking about our patients and community members from a standpoint, or flipping the conversation from what is wrong with you to what has happened to you. And hopefully if you dwell on those two questions, you can see the wisdom in moving to that approach. One is that the person is broken, and the other is that the person is just making decisions that may be yielding some undesirable results. And then lastly, this cognitive behavioral therapy is the concept that we have control over our cognition, and what we know or don't know is a part of, is related to our emotions, our thoughts, and ultimately our behaviors. And if I can control my thoughts and my emotions, then I can control my behavior. And so that is a model that I think it can be very helpful in the work that we do. And then lastly, on the back of page 8, right at the bottom, are some things that you can do yourself to become more culturally competent and move from, and recognize what to do with those zeros and minuses that you may have in your chart. And so these are some ways to reconcile those minuses and zeros that you may have in your chart. My name is Andre Koen. I have gone over my time. I really appreciate yours. Have a great day. And I work at Mayo just like you, so call me anytime. And look forward to doing more sessions like this in the future and teaching many of you to do this session in the future. Thank you so much for your time.
You said you'd come back, so
yes,
you all heard it, right? Thank you, and thank you for signing in. I'm going to try to send everybody an email. We would love your feedback as to what you thought of this format, what you thought of some of the content, what you might like to see in the future too. So, and if it'll get people over here, we'll have it reviewed. So, yeah, you can just have that spa music going on.
Yes, I need to put it back on. So.
Anyway, thank you again so much. And thank you guys for taking the time out of your day.
We have choices though. We had a couple of talk about that. Yes, that's what we thought. had to reword it out of the reword, you know, as opposed to how.
And there are some apps Thank you.
Yeah.
That was great.
We'll see, I think, maybe some future.
Yes, yes.
So you're doing another section of
Yes,
fellows,
yes,
because the fellows,
Oh, that's a separate, I have to do a separate one for them. The
Oh.
fellows, every single time, it's really hard to find dates that work for everyone, and the 2 dates that we thought we might be able to get together, a lot of people, the fellows have mandatory.
so today they have like a mandatory core lecture. And finally
Yeah, and so, I asked our education coordinator, as the one, why don't we start the easy way? You give me dates.
Yeah.
The fellows are available, so I need to look at that.
So another way to think about it too is if
Okay.
if I can get 5 students, something else. So I don't need a lot of concentrated time if I can get it sparse. So if I can get
That may be something too, like for right now, I think this is a good.
yeah, no. So this group was really for the what we talked about. The fellow.
And see, I told Molly, we should have taped it, and we said that this is part of it.
Yeah, he said it, you heard it, I told Molly about it, I told Molly. No, and I totally get your point about, kind of the training the trainer and helping all of us, but I think, this is exactly the type of thing I was looking for, because I don't want it to feel like, now we're gonna go get a lecture about diversity and inclusion, and we're all gonna check a box that we have done. No, I want it to be a whole,
The other thing I want to include, but I know we talked to it, is really mix the people. Like have this kind of use to get, I like that stock, there's just people just sitting, but we don't want it to be like,
No.
you sit here, just because I can see that some of the, particularly some of the older staff members, if they're this country, they're just gonna quit. But if we put them together, I think that they'll be more, but,
we all see, they sit with the, and then they sit with the. Let us help you.
all right, let's.
So cool, thank you.
I'm gonna help, I'm just gonna go use the next.
Yeah. So if you want to, pick up everything and put it right in the box.
I'll sort it out later.
And it's the fellows, that'll be an interesting, dynamic thing, because they're all close members, looking at the agendas. Yes, I'm starting to talk old people talk. So I was ready to describe like a maniac. Oh, yeah. But, they're actually a very diverse group of individuals if we look at, Which is good. I like that. They're the ones that often get the inappropriate comments from patients.
So that, my position, I just cracked you up with that, when I get at it, I'm like the American.
Right. Right.
We found out.
You would think that with ethics and all the, automatic stuff that it should search for that, it should,
Yeah.
That's the whole point. It's supposed to be a smarter. Yeah, I just love that, I'm 54, so I love that kind of things, phrases like, well, at your age,
Yes.
are starting to creep into my conversation with my physician.
I've never been at the age when.
Try to take that as positively as I think you mean it.
Yeah, so I, like I said before, I overplan a little bit.
Yeah. Well, because you never know if you can get a car talking.
Right, so. That is that.
But you know, we probably put expectations on our young fellows, like, oh, well, you're young, so you'll know how to use a computer.
Right.
Not necessarily, you know. Some of them struggle with Epic more than some of our students that, you know.
Well, it's also, you might call it that,